If you are at least 29 years old, you could remember where you were when 9/11 happened. Do you remember? I was living in San Francisco, and that morning I was up really early and I was going through some emails, and I just got notice that my dissertation had been accepted, and I was excited and thinking what an incredible day. But then in the next hour or two, those events unfolded. The world changed. Where were you? Well, coming out of 9/11 in San Francisco, there was this feeling that we needed to learn more about other religions and about Islam and to create a cultural awareness and connection and community to make a safer world. We were able to get some large grants, and I was the founding president of a multi-faith network on the San Francisco Peninsula that included some 500 religious leaders, Hindus, Buddhists, imams, Muslims, and people of all different forms of Christianity. And we would hold these symposiums where we would just learn about one another and hear the beauty of each other's religion. Something interesting began to happen. I noticed when I would ask them about their religion, and if I had an authentic curiosity, how much I could learn from their zeal, what they were excited about. But I began to notice what they always asked me about. As a Christian, what they wanted to know. Every Buddhist and Muslim and Hindu and people from Wiccan and pagan religions, everything, they always wanted to know about Jesus. They just wanted to know more about Jesus Christ, His life, His teachings, His ministry. They could perceive, as outsiders as it were to our religion, they could perceive the most beautiful thing about Christianity is Jesus. Oh, the perception of outsiders. Oh, it can be special. Because I think they're exactly right. Jesus is what is so beautiful about Christianity. But it's interesting to me that Christians themselves can forget that. I mean, if we stay focused on Jesus, who He was, His gentleness, His love, His wisdom, His compassion, if we stayed focused just on Him, then our whole religion would take on His nature. But it seems like often Christianity is not very Jesus-like. It's as if Christianity needs to be more Christian. I just finished preaching a sermon series on Paul's letter to the Colossians, and that letter is all about how the church should keep Jesus at the center of everything. Paul had a personal experience of the Christ on the Damascus Road. He was changed. He then went and began to form spiritual communities around the Mediterranean. And in Colossians, he's just trying to remind us, stay focused. The central content of our religion is Jesus. These days, if you ask people about organized religion, they'll give you a lot of negative appraisals. They'll say organized religion is hypocritical, too political, too self-interested, too dogmatic. They'll give you a lot of negative things. But if you poll people about Jesus, everybody thinks He's awesome. Virtually everybody can just tell Jesus is awesome. Well, do you see that disparity between organized religion and Jesus? We need to bring it back together. If churches were just all about Him, then people would love churches because they love Jesus. So we're called the United Church of Christ. That's our denomination. And so it sounds in the title that we would keep Jesus utterly central. But like almost all churches, I'm not sure we do. You could even walk into a UCC church and not even hear Jesus talked about in the worship. I think we can all go sideways and talk more about politics or things we think that are relevant rather than just speaking of Him. People love Him. Every time they come to church, they should hear more about Him and learn something about His teachings every single time. There are a couple jokes that show that even a denomination called the United Church of Christ can lose its focus. There's a couple jokes. One, what does UCC stand for? Unitarians Considering Christ. Meaning that we don't seem to be as lush in our excitement about Jesus as we should be. Rather, we sort of stand off and merely consider him occasionally. Or there's another joke. What do you get if you mix a UCCer with a Jehovah's Witness? Somebody that'll knock on your door and have nothing to say. Meaning we forget our core content. What's the content of the faith? It's Jesus. I think there's a fear among open-minded Christians like ourselves that if you focus too much on Jesus, it'll sound like you're this closed-minded place. Isn't this odd that somehow we think that Jesus is what evangelical churches are most about, and that we don't want to be too dogmatic? No, if you talk about Jesus and you talk about him a lot, then you're talking about a non-judgmental, positive regard for everyone, a type of open-mindedness and an embrace of the world. If you talk more about Jesus, you'll even be more open-minded than ever. Well, Paul's letter tries to keep reminding us, stay focused on Jesus. You know, as I was preaching that sermon series, another point occurred to me. In Paul's letters, he uses a phrase some 200 times. It's en Christo. And I talked about that in the sermon series, that Paul's phrase en Christo, in Christ, is radically mystical. We forget this about Paul. He had a mystical experience of Jesus. His whole sense of religion is deeply mystical, that somehow we are in Christ. You see, it's the mystic that feels unified with all reality. And he sees Christ in this incredibly mystical way. When he says the word Christ, it means both this love that structures the universe, this mystical principle holding all reality together, and he also means the historical Jesus, or Jesus of Nazareth. He means that whole sweep. And when he says en Christo some 200 times, he's meaning you can feel unified with the essence of reality. I know that's really mystical. Well, I think sometimes we also forget that our religion is mystical at its core. We think religion is mostly about a set of beliefs you hold in your head, or it's a bunch of traditions and rituals. But Paul the mystic reminds us right at the center of our faith is this experience. Have you ever had some personal experience of feeling connected to things, or some moment of illumination or clarity? Have you had a spiritual experience of some sort? Paul seems to be saying that's right at the center of our faith. But you could come to church. You could come to a lot of churches, and you might never know that really this is all based in something that can happen within you. Why don't churches try to foster spiritual experiences more? Why don't, like when you come to church, the whole focus is, could we create that moment for you that you sense there's a higher power, there's something more, there's a spiritual realm? You would think the church would mostly be about spiritual practices that would create that moments for human beings, because once you've had that moment like Paul did, it's forever yours. It's a type of knowledge you now possess. You sensed there was another realm. You sensed a love that abides. That will change you forever. So why don't churches double down on that? Focus on personal spiritual experiences. You would think then we'd come on a Sunday morning, maybe we would just meditate or try to create some moment where that could happen to you. Well, you know, there might be one reason we don't, or at least churches historically haven't focused on it. And this insight comes from William James, the great Harvard psychologist and examiner of the religious experience. He thought that mysticism was a core aspect to religion, and that he thought mysticism was a true form of knowledge. If you've had an experience, that it's good and right that you consider that something that has changed your mind now, your approach to life, yes. But he thought the key to true mysticism is that insight you possess can never be imposed on someone else. You can't take it as your truth that you can then put on others and say, you better believe this. Well, you see, too often in history, churches have wanted to impose their beliefs. The mystical, you're not allowed to impose that on anyone else. You can claim it for your truth. But churches, frankly, like to have some institutional control. You better believe this. This is what we know to be true. Mysticism subverts that. Maybe churches have shied away for that reason. You know, I'm sharing a few insights that have been lingering in my mind from my sermon series, and I want to share one more. I mentioned that in Paul's letter to the Colossians, when he says Christ, he means that whole sweep from the love that is the essence of reality to Jesus of Nazareth. And in the last part of that sermon series, I was talking about the historical Jesus, and that how we can know that if we're supposed to keep Jesus central, then that the historical Jesus was this radical egalitarian, this incredible teacher of nonviolence. We know the content, that we could keep Jesus central and follow that content. We know that Jesus was a mystic or a spirit person that experienced the spiritual realm. We could stay focused on those elements. But there was something lingering in my mind as I was preaching that. There's the interesting fact that when it does come to the historical Jesus, we have very actual little information. You'd be surprised how little historical record there is of figures of antiquity like Jesus. So, for example, we know practically nothing about his childhood. Only one mention in Luke of him as a 12-year-old. But essentially, we know nothing from 0 to 29. In the other Gospels, he just appears as an adult at the River Jordan, seemingly out of nowhere. We know very little about him. For example, the Gospels don't even tell us whether he was married or not. We have no historical record with whether he was married. But take that as an example. Was Jesus married? Well, about 99% of first century Palestinian Jews were married. 99%. It would be so odd not to be married. You would think the Bible would mention that he wasn't married, but it doesn't mention anything. But interestingly, the Bible doesn't mention any sort of basic biographical details of Jesus. It never says what he looks like. Think of that. I mean, in a modern story about a person, you'll tell a lot about what they look like, how they act in particular situations, and in modern stories, you go into their consciousness. You get to hear what they're thinking. You don't get to go inside Jesus' head at all. You get to hear what he says, and you get to see what he does. But we really have little information about his biography. Well, as I was thinking about that, it does occur to me that there might be some divine purpose in giving us little information about him so that you can project your imagination, your faithful imagination, and you can then create for yourself a faith image of Jesus. I would argue that you have some notion of Jesus in your mind and in your heart. And you've created that image of Jesus through sermons and articles you've read and artwork you've seen. You've created some image of Jesus. Then you have to make sure you keep letting that faith image be formed in community by what you continue to learn about Christ. It would be very easy to just stick with some image you have within yourself of him, and that might end up being a pretty self-serving image. I mean, for example, most Anglos like me, the moment I say the word Jesus, I'm kind of thinking of a white dude. Obviously, Jesus was not a white guy. I mean, you should let some of the historical information kind of inform your faith image, just to make sure that your Jesus isn't just serving your purposes, that your Jesus is the Christ. I think that's a lot of what we do at church, is try to keep informing your sense of who he was. Because my friends, if we keep gathering like this, I know this is the digital sermon, but we're in church right now. If we keep gathering like this and learning more about him and evolving in our understanding of him, then we will become more truly Christian, more beautiful. May this be so for you. God bless.